Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and back with me this week, as ever, we have Spike's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello.
And Spike columnist, Ella Whelan.
Hi.
Coming up on the show, the return of Partygate, Ukraine 50 days on, the murder of David Amess, and the French elections. So this week, Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak were fined by the police. It makes them the first office holders, respectively, to have been sanctioned by the law while in office. Tom, this Partygate scandal is back with a vengeance. What have you made of it?
I've been slightly more unmoved this time around, I think it's fair to say. I think a lot of us have sort of oscillated wildly between being quite infuriated by the double standards and hypocrisy and all the rest of it, but also quite unmoved by what is ultimately being built up as a big political scandal, but what it's about having birthday cake or some socially distanced drink in a garden, and you kind of move from one to the other. I think with Partygate itself, it was the fact that this started out as a kind of pearl-clutching media campaign, trying to prove it was one rule for them and one rule for us, and kind of often quite kind of inane kind of gotchas over minor breakings of the rules. But when you stack all these things on top of each other, and then you look at some of the more egregious sort of violations, like the party in the number 10 garden at the height of the first lockdown, on the very same day, Oliver Dowden announcing that we can meet one person outside. It was just to the point where it was just an insult to our intelligence. I think the thing that gets missed in all of this, though, is the fact that you've got a media which is hopping mad about this particular issue, talking about it as a constitutional crisis, acting as if this is the worst thing that's ever happened and the most shameful thing that's ever happened in British politics. And yet this is the same media that fundamentally failed to submit the lockdown to any kind of proper scrutiny, if anything, egged it on. They become obsessed with, breaches of these unprecedented rules, but not particularly interested in how these unprecedented rules came about in the first place. And I think that's the place that I end up with all of this, I guess, is that in the end, what's worse, keeping kids out of school, old people having to die alone, criminalising social interaction, or the fact that the people at the top broke the ridiculous rules that they wrote for everyone else is bad, but it's not the biggest issue under the sun, definitely. Yeah,
I mean, Ella, we're talking really about a £50 fine, and yet we've had some people come out and say that this basically calls into question Johnson's unfitness to deal with the war in Ukraine. How can he stand up to Putin if he's a criminal like this? I mean, it has just gone a bit far, hasn't it, some of the reaction?
Well, I think part of the problem is that it has been turned into this question of the PCN, and that completely trivialises it, because obviously, the suggestion that a Prime Minister would, or indeed a Chancellor would resign because they got a talking to by the police and a fixed penalty notice seems ridiculous. And actually, there was a cabinet minister doing the rounds on the radio this morning who was kind of almost sort of chuckling and saying, well, I've had 6 points on my license. We all bend the rules a little bit. We all make mistakes. And he's come out and has apologized and blah, blah, blah. And of course he's right. But that's, as Tom says, that wasn't the point. But the fact that the media has made it about a Prime Minister being cautioned or whatever it is by the police, and the fact that this is the question of the fine, means they ignore all the actual real substance of it, which is that you had politicians laying down law because they believed that the public couldn't be trusted to take sensible decisions, make small risks to pay off, bigger benefits, wear a mask to go see your granny, whatever it is, that they thought we needed really strict restrictions, but that they could make their own decisions. But obviously the reason why the media won't focus on that is because they bought it as well. They were into that extreme lockdown narrative. It was very hard. You have to remember that throughout the last 2 years, it was both very difficult to hear anyone on mainstream media channels criticize lockdown or suggest that there might be a different route to doing this. And those who did got, like Talk Radio, got taken off or banned or slapped with these kind of little posters on social media saying that they were saying something dangerous in relation to COVID regulations. So, I have to admit, it's one of those kind of catch-22 things. I am really angry about it. In a different context, I would want to see heads roll, not because of the birthday cake, but because of the fact of this sort of complete breach of public trust. But it's also the case that, number one, the people who are gunning for Boris Johnson aren't caring about this principle. Lots of them are anti-Brexit people who want to see him gone for a whole different reason. I don't want to give any succor to them. And it's also the case that who would step in his place? I mean, that's the terrible bind that we are in contemporary politics, which is that you have to think about these things. You have to think, well, would I want, Liz Truss or anyone else to be in the prime ministerial position at the moment in the context of war? No, I wouldn't. So for now, stay there.
I noticed she didn't say Rishi. He would have been the obvious candidate just a few months ago.
Yeah.
But it's
now the foreign secretary can't find Russia on a map.
I mean, it's worth thinking, you're talking about the media, gunning for lockdown. I mean, the COVID restrictions and rules and laws only folded at the end of March. I mean, just this Christmas, people were talking about having another lockdown, despite it being, a year on from the vaccine rollout. It's interesting how quickly we forget some of this stuff. I mean, Tom, what have you made of that side of it?
Well, I think there's a lot of kind of amnesia about these things, I suppose. I mean, even in terms of the rules themselves, because they were so confusing. I mean, there's so much latitude even for the police to how they're going to find you. I mean, the nature of those regulations was such they give an awful lot of discretion to the authorities, which is why the powers were so abused. I mean, you saw all those kind of ridiculous situations of police overreach. And a good example of this is the fact that the number 10 birthday cake, allegedly 10-minute long party for Boris Johnson's birthday, that was briefed to the Times newspaper at the time that it happened. No one batted an eyelid because these things are kind of a bit confusing. So again, there's short memories about a lot of this stuff. I think, but with Partygate, I think it's the sheer volume of it, it's the sheer sort of brazenness of it, and it's the lying basically to kind of pretend that it didn't happen. And I think this, it's genuinely really damaged Johnson. I don't think he can really properly recover from this. It's just contributed to that sense that he's really sort of spent and in it for himself. And then you kind of look around and think, what else is he offering? Net zero. I mean, it doesn't add up to very much. But ultimately, the judgment should be with voters. And it seems like people who don't like him in politics and the media are just desperate to secure a resignation as a way of just getting rid of him without having to bother the electorate with it, which is something which definitely troubles me. I think I have to say that it's as the days roll on in particular, you are just sort of struck by the level of sort of histrionics from the media about this stuff. Talked to, gesturing a bit to it there about them calling it a constitutional crisis and stuff. The journalists who uncovered this running around acting as if they've genuinely uncovered like Watergate or something. I think it's really quite strange. I mean, it speaks to the degradation of journalism to a certain degree, but I think it also speaks to just the nature of political journalism sort of since Brexit and a bit before then, which is that they have become increasingly sort of unhinged a little bit. Brexit just completely scrambled their brains. And so you see them running around acting as if essentially in 2016, Boris Johnson invented lying. Yeah. Or that before 2016, all prime ministers were utterly morally unimpeachable and would never do anything as crazy as lie or, mislead anyone or break the law. This might be the first prime minister to be caught breaking the law. Yeah. I doubt he was the only one ever to break the law. You see this kind of like faux naivety in relation to all of this stuff. And as a result of that, I think we're just seeing one of those sort of, one of the crescendos of that particular sort of aspects in the media, which is that because Brexit just scrambled their brains so much, they've taken to being incredibly hysterical about absolutely anything Boris Johnson does, which makes it more difficult to criticise him because it's bad, but it's not the worst thing that's ever happened. Let's put it that way.
So on the day we're recording this, we're now 50 days into the invasion of Ukraine. And it's interesting to sort of cast our minds back to when this first happened, when Russia first invaded. And there was actually very little hope at the time for Ukraine. Even US intelligence sources were suggesting that Kiev could fall within days. But now we're looking at it and Ukraine is standing strong. Tom, what have you made of this?
I think it's been really incredible. And I think it really sort of pays testament to how strong the Ukrainian resistance has been, but also how strong their commitment to fighting for their nation and self-determination has been. I mean, in a sense, I think the impetus for Russia to invade is quite similar to the impetus of some of the kind of international relations set who've been basically demanding that Ukraine should, chuck it all in at the nearest possible opportunity. It's this idea that Ukraine is kind of a fake country, that it's kind of phony, that as soon as the Russian tanks would roll in, you would have the nation would easily fall because it'd be split loyalties. No one would want to fight for it. That's just been completely obliterated by what's taking place. And the way in which the dynamics in the war have shifted have been nothing short of remarkable. I mean, I think it was interesting. We're recording this the day after there was this explosion on the flagship of the Black Sea fleet, the Russian fleet. And it's the same warship that you remember in the early days of the invasion was threatening those soldiers on Snake Island and saying, surrender or we'll blow you up. And they essentially said, fuck you. now we're in a position where this warship is essentially, it's either been sunk or being towed away, either because according to the Russians, there was just some, miraculous explosion, or according to the Ukrainians, they actually, shot at it. It just, as an example of how this has gone from being seen as a sort of a plucky, but ultimately, it's never going to go anywhere
Doomed.
kind of defense, doomed, exactly, defense of their nation. Thank you for that. To something where they've really genuinely pushed Russia back. Now we're not talking about Russia trying to roll into Kiev. They've moved their forces out from the outskirts of Kiev. It's all refocusing it in the south and the east. And I think it's a testament to, again, just how kind of strong that feeling is and how fundamentally wrong both Russia and even a lot of Western observers were in thinking that Ukraine was essentially a sort of fake country that a lot of its own citizens wouldn't fight for. That's just been completely obliterated, for lack of a better phrase, in the fight that they put up this past 50 days.
Ella?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that at the start there was lots of people saying, well, can you even really talk about Ukrainian sovereignty because look, it's so corrupt. And yeah, sure, the word democracy is a bit of a difficult descriptive word to use in relation to Ukraine because of the nature of what went on politically in terms of corruption or other stuff beforehand, and sort of alliance with oligarchs and all the rest of it. However, the test of a nation and its people and its belief in citizenship and sovereignty and all of that is the best test of it is obviously when it comes under pressure from invasion. And we know that Ukrainians have stepped up and proved that, whereas there might have been questions beforehand, they are acting as a solidified nation. And there's lots of people who still maintain it's almost like a childish response to war. So there was kind of real outrage from the international relations set. But I had this myself as well. You were thinking, well, how does what I think about Western intervention play into this? I have a principal position against Western intervention. But of course, the nature of this war kind of throws a lot of that out of the window. And you have to think in terms of what's happening today. Tim Black wrote a great article on Spiked this week looking at how there's this sort of double thing happening where people will show solidarity for Ukraine and say, isn't it wonderful or isn't it terrible that they're being bombed? Or this story of this woman who lost her daughter and, all this, go along with all the horrible stuff and say, poor sympathy there. But then when something practical happens, like Boris Johnson goes over, does a bit of a photo op, but as Tim says, argues for some material things and also does the important thing that photo ops are meant to do, which is broadcasts a message across Europe and to Russia as well. They kind of say, no, you can't, Boris is an asshole and, this is just sort of like playing around and we still hate him. And you think, how do you think they're going to win the war if not with material and political support from their European and other allies? So it's a kind of, you don't really know what these people want from this. You think they want Ukraine to win in this kind of fantasy land where nothing difficult or complicated has to happen, whereas that's not the real world, and that's not the real world of war.
And Tom, obviously there are other voices, although they've been slightly more muted, calling for even greater intervention in Ukraine, essentially calling for us to go to war with Russia directly. Thankfully, that kind of line of thinking hasn't really taken over, right?
Well, I think the West has actually been quite cautious in relation to those questions throughout all of this, and for good reason, because you don't want to provoke a broader conflict unnecessarily. You don't want to just rush into World War III for the hell of it to demonstrate how serious you are about this particular issue. But what they have done and what they're continuing to do, which is to arm Ukraine, which is to give them what they need to fight for themselves. It remains their fight, but it's still something which, our solidarity is not just hashtags and, sending moral support and taking refugees, has an actual proper consequence, which is to give them what they need in order to resist the aggressor. And again, we can talk about how that's a difficult line to walk and that there's certain things that could ultimately provoke. But we need to remember who started this, really. Yeah. It's important. There's important points to be made about what's happened since the fall of the Soviet Union in relation to NATO expansion, the humiliation of Russia, the transition from communism and the politics of that, and how these general forces and some of the decisions that have been made in the West have contributed to the kind of leadership and the kind of geopolitical position that Russia finds itself in at the moment. But I think for to talk about in this situation as if the horror is of the West arming the Ukrainians to defend their own nation. It's Russia for invading the country.
Yeah.
And I think that's something which needs to be talked about. It's just a fundamentally different context, trying to topple some despot somewhere just because the West happens to dislike him, or they feel that they could extract some strategic gain from doing so, or from arming a bunch of crazed Islamists because you like them slightly more than the other group of crazed Islamists. I mean, this is a fundamentally different proposition. This is a nation state with democratically elected leadership, troubled though it is, but still fighting for its own survival and fighting for its own sovereignty and self-determination. I think it's just a completely different picture. But at the same time, of course, that doesn't mean being gung-ho about these things. That doesn't mean demonstrating one's commitment to these values by trying to provoke a conflict that I don't think anyone would benefit from, in terms of it being that much broader, sucking all these other forces, and essentially ultimately taking the initiative away from the Ukrainians themselves and making them one part in a much bigger, much more destructive conflict.
And it is really important to keep a watchful eye on that side of things because, earlier this week we had this sort of rumour circulating of whether or not chemical weapons had been used. And instantly, with no verification that it had happened, you have a statement from Liz Truss saying, well, we will hold back at nothing. Nothing is off the table, which everyone in the British media took to mean NATO troops on the ground. And then the next 2 days was all about, should we send in troops? And you think, Jesus, hang on a minute, for something that hasn't even been verified, you're already jumping there. And then there was Joe Biden's use of the word genocide this week, which equally, is kind of a very unhelpful way of politically escalating things. But, particularly at the time when other sets of the American political class are still talking about the need for not compromise, but getting around the negotiating table. I think if you start it's a bit like the war crimes thing. If you start throwing around the word genocide, it's very hard to get around a negotiating table. So, the funny thing is that Boris Johnson has stood out this week as being someone who has handled it very well, very sensibly, in the kind of way you would hope a sensible leader in a difficult geopolitical situation to do. Whereas there are some of them that are still a bit mad.
Let's move on to talk about David Amess. His murderer, Ali Harbi Ali, was sentenced to life imprisonment this week. He was found guilty of stabbing the Conservative MP outside his constituency office in Southend last year. I mean, Tom, the discussion around this has been quite strangely muted, I think it's fair to say.
Oh, definitely. I remember the day after the trial concluded, I was going through the kind of London Politico email, which is obviously very read amongst journalists. I'm not sure if anyone else reads it, but at the very bottom, the very last story, there's one line about this particular trial, and I thought that was really telling. I think that told us everything about our skewed priorities and the really unserious and frankly bizarre way in which we treat Islamist terrorism, and that we treat this particular instance. Definitely. I mean,
it wasn't on any front page either.
Exactly. It was
just a tiny bit in the Telegraph.
Tiny little paragraph in Telegraph, wasn't on any of the other front pages. And Brendan O'Neill's written something for us this week, comparing it to the aftermath of the trial of Thomas Mayer, who was the far right extremist who murdered Joe Cox, where there was actually this backlash against the Daily Mail because it didn't put it on its front page, which I think is an interesting sort of contrast there. Loads of very prominent commentators demanding to know why this hadn't happened. Well, why not in this situation? From the off, I think the David Amess case, more than any other, has just completely revealed our cowardice in relation to the Islamist terrorist question. It was pretty clear from very early on in the investigation what this was. Obviously, it wasn't confirmed, but nevertheless, all the signs pointed towards the police were treating it as an act of Islamist political murder, effectively. And yet the response, as we talked about many times, was to start talking about online anonymity, to talk about trolling. There was even a David's Law, which was to ban online anonymity, as if, again, the problem here was that he got accosted by some Twitter trolls or something like that, which is fundamentally not what happened. And I think we've seen that again repeated in the wake of the trial. We've seen the Speaker of the House of Commons talk about how this is a good prompt to remind us that we all need to be nicer to each other in politics, as if that will dissuade some Islamist scumbag from carrying out another atrocity. And you would hope that this would be the point at which, or something like this would be the point at which the political class and the media class would kind of grow up, would recognise the reason they're not talking about this is because ultimately they're scared of talking about this for all kinds of reasons. Yeah. But they shouldn't be, because there are lethal consequences if they don't. But there's been nothing this week or in the last few years, really, which would suggest they're about to shake themselves out of that particular moral muddle that they find themselves in.
Ella, I mean, we should talk a bit more about that kind of online anonymity question. I mean, it was crazy looking back on it, where, you know, it was almost a sense of unreality where MP after MP in Parliament, you know, shared their stories of people being rude to them on Twitter, and it was just bad.
Well, if you were going to be really nasty, you'd say that it was just quite a despicable a display of narcissism, and that actually in the wake of one of their colleagues' brutal murder, too many people in the House of Parliament made it about themselves in this really quite distasteful way, talking about, how many people had said that they were fat or stupid online or something like this. And when you watch now, obviously, things that couldn't be made public at the time, the video footage of Ali straight away after the incident and him being interviewed by police, he very quickly offers up the fact that this was terror related. They say, what drove you or something? He's like, terrorism. You know, it's crystal clear from the get-go. They don't have to squeeze it out of him. And you understand that obviously for legal reasons, none of that can be put out at the start. But there was this real disjunct where you know, most people, without buying into stereotypes or all that stuff that gets leveled at people who try and talk about Islamist terrorism, that quite clearly this was something, not some kind of tweeter gone mad, but it was related to, it had all the hallmarks of all the previous attacks we've seen in recent years. And the people who have the most political power, MPs, who are meant to be thinking about public interest, who are meant to be leading the public and talking truthfully, just took this in a complete wild different direction. David's Law was instituted by Mark Francois, who, you know, was a very good friend of David Amess. And actually, I was debating him on the evening of Amos's memorial, and he got very upset when I suggested that David's Law had nothing to do with Amos's murder. But you do think, I mean, even someone who was that close to him was able to kind of basically piggyback off of his friend's murder to talk about this completely different thing of online anonymity.
To demand censorship, essentially.
Which was basically a desire to kind of clamp down at, and also insulate. This is what I'm talking about, the kind of narcissism of MPs. What they wanted to do was to take the murder of this man who, in particular, David Amess, had a particular belief in face-to-face open surgeries. He was very much for, you know, the idea that you had to be open and transparent with your constituents and, you know, not just press the flesh, but actually have a kind of serious interaction with people. And all these other people his fellow MPs who hate the idea of that, don't do surgeries and actually want to be even more kind of cushioned away from the public by means of not allowing us to talk straight with them online, saw their opportunity. And so it just leaves you with a really bad taste in your mouth. And I bet the people who were close to Amos, I wouldn't be surprised if they were really upset at the fact that his name not only now is associated with all this nonsense, but also that no one is talking about him. I mean, I think that's a real tragedy, that no one is talking about the fact that an elected representative of this country and a human being was murdered by this guy. And we've all moved on. That can't be right.
One thing that has emerged from the trial of Ali Harbi Ali was that he was actually an alumnus, shall we say, of the Prevent De-Radicalisation scheme. And he's not alone. He's, you know, many terrorists who've gone on to commit atrocities have actually been through this official de-radicalisation scheme. I mean, what have you made of that, Tom?
Well, it's the story that keeps repeating itself. I mean, we've seen it in relation, I think, to the killer at the Reading terrorist attack. I believe he didn't kill anyone, but the guy tried to stab people in Streatham had contact with the Prevent scheme. And Usman Khan is obviously the clearest example, because of the fact that he killed 2 people at a conference at London Bridge on rehabilitation, in which he was kind of invited as almost like a poster boy for someone who had gone through that successfully. This story keeps repeating itself. I think this is another indication of how we just do not take this threat particularly seriously. There was a quote in the press this week from someone who knows more about de-radicalisation than I do, saying that Prevent is ultimately like a parish council response to a counter-terror issue, you know, getting people in and having a word with them and asking them if, you know, they plan to act on their crazed fantasies. It's just ultimately insufficient, and doesn't recognise how serious this is, that this is fundamentally a political threat. And we've got to remember about the scale of it. This is the thing that we're ignoring is essentially the vicious ideology which has killed, if you take 7/7 onwards, 93 people in Britain. We're not talking here about people who just get a bit carried away because of the slightly toxic nature of political discourse. Ali, interestingly, said he was surprised to find out that constituency surgeries were even a thing. This is not someone who followed political debate and the Brexit debate online and was inspired because Boris Johnson said humbug in Parliament and he thought MPs are therefore, fair game for physical violence and murder. It's ultimately absurd. The response that we saw in the wake of the attack, I think, would be as bizarre as if someone started saying, in memory of David Amess, we need to, bring the speed limit down to 20 miles an hour nationwide. I mean, it's just completely unrelated. It shows how unserious we're being. And we know the reason that people are dodging this is because of the fact that they've got it into their heads that this is a dangerous subject to talk about for two different reasons, because of the fact that they're the broader public, white working class people in particular, are always the kind of implied villain of the piece. If you have this discussion, you're basically just going to whip them up into some sort of anti-Muslim pogrom that they're incapable of grasping the difference between the ideology of Islamism and Islam, a religion that millions of law-abiding Brits, people they work with and are friends with, follow and never harm anybody. Or on the flip side is that this will somehow upset Muslims to talk about this, that this thing which they abhor as much as anyone else, which is plaguing their own communities as much as anything else, is something that is too hot to handle for them. It just projects such a low view. It reflects the cowardice of the political class. And you would think that when one of their own had their lives claimed because of this ideology, it would again spark a bit more of a serious conversation. But as we all know, it hasn't, even this week.
And finally, let's talk about the French elections. So on Sunday, French voters went to the polls for the first round of their presidential elections. And in a bit of a rerun of 2017, in a few weeks' time, Emmanuel Macron, the incumbent president, will face Marine Le Pen again. I mean, Tom, it's a bit odd. I mean, it doesn't speak that well of Macron that he's ultimately in the same position as he was 5 years ago.
I mean, he was supposed to be the guy who would vanquish populism. Now, I don't like to throw that word around too liberally, and obviously the National Rally, formerly National Front, has a slightly longer history than recent years, and a much grimmer one. But nevertheless, the idea that he was going to push back the far right in France, certainly, that he was going to kind of herald the kind of rolling back of the general tide of dissatisfaction that was forcing voters to go for parties that were against the establishment in one form or another. And as you say, we're ending up in a situation where it's Le Pen and Macron in the runoff again, Le Pen getting a much better showing than last time. I mean, some of the snap polls after the first round were suggesting that there could be a couple of points in it, which is remarkable.
Within the margin of error.
Within the margin of error, exactly. Things have settled down a little bit now. But ultimately now Le Pen and her party have become a feature of French politics, and this is all under Macron's rule. And this is something that shouldn't really have surprised anyone. There was this kind of tendency for particularly the kind of liberal European elite, if you like, to kind of just breathe a sigh of relief after 2017. That's if it was job done. The triumphalism was bizarre. There was front covers of The Economist, I think, of him walking on water and things like this. And yet, if you looked at the number of abstentions, even in that vote, and this time around it's gone up slightly, you're seeing the dissatisfaction. We've had the whole Gilets jaunes the rising, essentially, in the course of the past few years, which was fundamentally a kind of working class anti-Macron movement in many respects, against the political establishment. And it's just quite clear that he is not the problem, such as it is that he was supposed to solve, he fundamentally hasn't. There's obviously still a lot of dissatisfaction. There's still a lot of people who will not want to vote for either of them. But one thing that I think you're starting to see is that you dare say there's going to be fewer people who are going to be willing to go in and hold their nose and vote for Macron than last time, such as that he's failed, to really sort of offer any kind of alternative to the dissatisfaction they feel. So I think the fact that it's being closer this time around just tells us a lot about Macron as much as anything else.
The leprosy of populism is how he memorably described it a few years ago. And yeah, I mean, looking at those results, there's now a sort of majority in favour of anti-establishment candidates, some of them very nasty, in fact. Think about 7% voting for Zemmour, who is even further to the right of Le Pen. Le Pen was able to actually make herself seem semi-reasonable in contrast to Zemmour.
Still not fully detoxified, such as this.
Exactly.
Say, but, some grim policies. But
I think that's, I wouldn't want to be a French citizen right now because you have the kind of the poison of Le Pen, really, even though she's tried to, and, in some ways quite successfully managed to skate over some things, tone down some things, but it's very much all still there. Even if she talks about the importance of nations and nationalism, you know that's what she's actually talking about in relation to her anti-immigrant sentiment. But there was an article in Spike this week that talked about, kind of long read on the French elections, that talked about the fact that, you know, in the last few French elections, there have always the front runner, someone like Macron, have always been set against a far right person. And the thing that
3 of the past 5 elections.
Yeah. So the question is, where is this famous French left? You know, there's so, you know, we in Britain often talk about, oh, you know, we never do anything kind of concrete in relation to left-wing ideology. It's so pathetic. At least in France, they kind of like pick up cobblestones and all the rest of it. And yeah, we saw a bit of that with the Gilets jaunes. But actually, if you look at the fragmentation of the French left over the last 10 or more years, and indeed the inability of Mélenchon to get into the running in the second round, mainly because he embodies this kind of middle-class leftism, which doesn't have any time for the Gilets jaunes. You know, in fact, this article on Spike made the point that there is far less actual working-class people in French left politics than there ever has been before. And so this is just a genuine sense of people being out of touch. And then on the other hand, you have a very strong message from the Macron government, very strong, that says, what happens when you go out and protest, you know, with the Gilets jaunes or anything else? What happens if you raise your disquiet about the French government? We send in police and we crack your skull open, which is what they did to the Gilets jaunes in Paris. We'll gas you and we'll beat you up, and there will be no room for you to make your voice heard in this French democracy. And so it's hardly a surprise that not just left-wingers, but sort of like the people who are sort of almost liberal centrists who would have had time for Macron previously have watched what he's done over the last 2 years. And, you know, there's a little bit of pandemic stuff playing in there as well, because France was so extreme in relation to some of its restrictions. I'm going to be watching closely the spoiled ballots, because I think they will tell you a lot. And obviously there's more notice in France than they are in other countries. But, you know, I would not be able to vote for either of them. I don't think even there's that much of a strong kind of, you know, what you saw in relation to Trump, with people picking Trump rather than Clinton. That is even kind of dampened here because Le Pen is so extreme and Macron is so odious. And so it really is, it's quite a depressing but telling example of what's happening in a lot of European countries, which is you have an absent left and then you have a kind of relatively extreme right kind of picking up pace with this lethargic and also quite authoritarian technocratic kind of centrism, which, you know, you'd hope that something emerges out of this in the future, that there's some kind of alternative, but it's a depressing picture.
But what do you think is going to happen, Fraser? Because you actually like speak French, follow these things much closely than me.
I do think Macron is still going to win. I do think that there are enough people out there to hold their nose, and I think that actually, you know, we saw last week as the polls tightened in favour of Le Pen, there was even some polls suggesting she was going to come out on top. I think that's sort of scared enough people to want to go out. You know, at the end of the day, as long as Macron can say that he's the candidate of the Fifth Republic, you know, in France they talk about this thing called the Republican Front, where people bandy together to keep out the extremes. As long as Macron is able to do that, then he'll be fine. But let's not pretend that Macron is an attractive candidate, that he has anything in particular to offer France. Certainly no model that fellow Europeans should want to follow. You know, as I agree, I mean, it's quite a depressing picture. I think that the abstentions are going to be the real story. Last time around, had the highest, you know, level of spoiled ballots, and people are faced with the same miserable choice. So hopefully next time around something more interesting and something more progressive emerges out of this. Thank you so much for watching the Spikes podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spike's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.